Stepdaughter's Revenge. When betrayal turns deadly, criminal story. Jessica had lived most of her life under the heavy shadow of her stepfather, Carl. Ever since her mother, Linda, had married Carl when Jessica was just 13, the dynamics in the house had shifted. While Linda had always been loving and nurturing, Carl was different. He was reserved, a man who seemed content to live in the background, watching life unfold around him rather than engaging with it. He never overtly mistreated Jessica, but there was always something unsettling about him. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on at first, just an underlying tension that seemed to hang in the air, as if Carl was always waiting for something. For years, Jessica dismissed her instincts, telling herself she was just being overly sensitive. But deep down, she knew something was off. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. As time went on, the awkwardness between them became more palpable. Carl wasn't cruel, not in an obvious way. He didn't yell or lose his temper like some of the other fathers Jessica had heard about from her friends at school. But there was a quiet coldness in the way he looked at her. He was distant, detached. He never seemed to care about her life, her interests, or her dreams. Jessica could never recall a time when Carl had shown any real interest in her. They rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, and even then, their conversations felt strained, like there was a chasm between them that neither could cross. It was as if Carl had never truly accepted her as part of his family, as if she was an intruder in his life. At first, Jessica tried to make an effort. She wanted to get along with him, to fit into the new family dynamic. She'd ask him about his day, attempt to engage him in conversation, but his answers were always short, uninterested. Whenever Jessica or her mother tried to involve him in family activities, he would excuse himself, retreating to his study or to watch TV alone. Over time, Jessica's attempts to connect became less frequent. It was easier to retreat to her own room, away from the tension, and focus on school or her hobbies. But even in her sanctuary, she couldn't completely escape the feeling that Carl was watching her, waiting. It was a sensation that made her skin crawl, though she couldn't explain it to anyone. Her mother, Linda, was the exact opposite of Carl. She was warm and open, always there with a smile or a hug when Jessica needed it. Linda had been through her fair share of struggles before meeting Carl, and Jessica had always admired her mother's resilience. But Linda was also fiercely loyal, especially when it came to her marriage. She never seemed to question Carl's behavior, even though Jessica had a growing sense that something wasn't right in their household. Linda would often comment on how lucky they were to have Carl in their lives, how he was a good man, a provider. Jessica could see the way Linda looked at Carl with admiration, even reverence. It made Jessica feel like an outsider in her own home, as if she didn't belong in the picture that her mother had painted of their perfect family. Despite the discomfort Jessica felt in Carl's presence, she had learned to live with it. She told herself it wasn't worth making a fuss. She didn't want to create any more tension, especially for her mother's sake. Carl's indifference was something Jessica had come to accept. She could deal with it, or so she thought. She buried her feelings, convinced that things would eventually get better. But over time, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more sinister was happening beneath the surface, something she couldn't see but felt in every interaction, every glance, every silence between her and Carl. When Jessica turned 16, things started to change. She wasn't the child she once was. She was growing into a young woman, and with that came a shift in her relationship with Carl. At first, it was subtle. A slight change in the way he looked at her when she walked into the room, a hint of something more than just a casual glance. The unease she had always felt around him began to grow stronger. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. It was as if Carl's gaze had become more deliberate, more focused. He would watch her longer than was comfortable, and Jessica noticed that he had begun to follow her movements more closely around the house. It wasn't overt, but it was there. It was in the way he would sit in the living room watching TV, but always aware of where she was and what she was doing. She tried to push the thought out of her mind, but it gnawed at her, this quiet sense of being observed. One evening, she caught him staring at her across the dinner table. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jessica could feel the weight of his eyes on her. She froze, caught in the discomfort of it, and for a split second, she wondered if he knew what she was thinking, if he could sense her growing suspicion. She quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but the encounter left her unsettled. That night, she lay in her bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The feeling of being watched lingered, and she couldn't shake it. Was she just imagining things, or was Carl really starting to become more fixated on her? The questions twisted in her mind, but there were no answers. Only the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The next few months were a blur of growing anxiety and confusion. Jessica began to notice even more signs that made her uncomfortable. Small things, things that might seem trivial to an outsider, but, to her, were all too telling. For example, whenever she came home from school, Carl would be sitting in the living room, watching her as she entered the house. He would ask questions about her day, questions that were far too specific for someone who claimed to be indifferent. "How was your history test?" he would ask, or "Did you see that new movie with your friends?" Jessica hadn't mentioned any of these things to him, yet he seemed to know every detail of her life. There were times when he would ask questions that suggested he knew where she had been, even if she hadn't told anyone. "Did you stop by the library after school?" he would ask, as though it was normal. How did he know these things? She couldn't understand it, but the thought of Carl tracking her every move made her skin crawl. Jessica tried to tell herself that maybe she was just being paranoid, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. There was a disquieting stillness about Carl, an eerie calmness in the way he moved through the house, like a predator stalking its prey. It was becoming impossible to ignore. There was one night when Jessica was doing her homework in the living room, and Carl sat across from her, reading a newspaper. She looked up for a moment, and their eyes met. Only for a second, but it felt like an eternity. He didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a slow, calculating smile that sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory, like he was savoring something only he could see. From that moment on, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that Carl was more than just a cold, distant figure in her life. He was watching her, studying her, and it felt as though she was being hunted. The next day, she decided to follow her instincts and search his study. She had to know what he was hiding. It was an old, dusty room in the back of the house that Carl had kept off limits to everyone except himself. The door was always locked, but Jessica had learned that Carl's routines were predictable. One afternoon, when he went to the store, she seized her chance. She found a way into his study and began to search through his things. What she found was more than she could have ever imagined. There were files, journals, meticulous records of her daily activities, notes about her friends, and even her routines. It was as if Carl had been tracking her every move for years. She found photos, too, photos of her taken through windows from across the street, and sometimes pictures of her in her room, captured without her knowledge. As the weight of what she was seeing settled over her, Jessica felt a rush of nausea. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was irrefutable. Carl had been spying on her, obsessing over her every move. In that moment, something inside Jessica snapped. All the years of unease, the little moments of discomfort that she had ignored, suddenly clicked into place. Carl was not the man her mother believed him to be. He wasn't just a cold stepfather. He was something darker, something much more dangerous. She needed to confront him. She needed to end this, before it was too late. The first instinct Jessica had when she stumbled upon the cameras hidden in her bedroom was disbelief. The object that had fallen from the drawer, the small, unmarked black device with a faint red blinking light, looked almost innocuous, a harmless gadget by all appearances. But the moment she touched it, a sinking feeling washed over her. She turned it over in her hand, her fingers trembling as she examined the tiny lens and the almost imperceptible wires sticking out of the side. She couldn't shake the thought. This was a camera. Her heart began to race as the implications of what she had found started to sink in. Was Carl spying on her? The idea seemed far-fetched at first. It didn't seem real. He wasn't overtly violent or abusive in any obvious way, There were no angry outbursts, no harsh words. Yet, now, standing there in her room, with the camera in her hand, everything suddenly felt different. Her bedroom, the one place where she had always felt safe, now seemed like a stage for someone else's perverse curiosity. Jessica had always trusted her instincts, and right now, every bone in her body screamed that she had uncovered something horrific. Her mind raced as she quickly pushed the camera aside and began to dig through the drawers more urgently. She threw aside papers, old books, and forgotten trinkets. And there, hidden in a corner behind some books, she found another camera, then another, and another. In total, 4 cameras hidden in various corners of her room, tucked away so cleverly that she hadn't noticed them until now. Her hands shook as she gingerly lifted each one from its hiding place. Each device was identical, small, discreet, almost unremarkable in appearance. The only thing that stood out was the tiny red light, still blinking. She felt a coldness spreading through her body as she realized what had been happening for who knows how long. Carl hadn't just been watching her from a distance. He had been watching her in the most intimate way possible. The idea was too surreal to fully process at first. It was one thing to think someone might be observing you from afar, but it was another to realize that someone had been recording your most private moments, without your knowledge, without your consent. Jessica dropped the cameras onto her bed and bolted out of her room. She was frantic, her mind in turmoil, her thoughts racing too quickly for her to follow. She had to get answers. Why? Why had Carl done this? She knew Carl was distant, but this was something entirely different. She could feel the walls of her house closing in on her. It was like a trap, one that she had been unknowingly walking into for years. She found herself in the hallway outside her mother's bedroom, her breath shallow and erratic. The urge to confront Carl right then and there was overwhelming, but something inside her held her back. What if he didn't deny it? What if he turned the tables and said she was just imagining things? She could already hear the rehearsed lines in her mother's voice. Carl would never do that. You're overreacting. Jessica's stomach twisted. She couldn't afford to be dismissed, not this time. Not when she had physical proof. With a sudden, sharp decision, Jessica turned and headed to Carl's office. His study was the one room in the house that was always off-limits to her. He had made it clear from the very beginning that he didn't want anyone going through his things, and Jessica had respected his wishes, at least on the surface. She had always suspected he was hiding something, but she hadn't dared to go against his rules until now. Now, there was no choice. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the doorknob. It was locked, as she expected. She wasn't surprised. Carl always kept the door locked when he wasn't home. She'd never questioned it before, though, always assuming it was just part of his need for privacy. But now, standing in front of it, she saw the locked door as a symbol of everything that was wrong. Every warning signal in her brain screamed at her to go back, to stop before she uncovered something worse than she could ever imagine. But she couldn't stop now. She had come too far. Forcing herself to take a deep breath, Jessica found a hairpin in her pocket and used it to pick the lock. The door clicked open with a soft snap, and Jessica winced at the sound, even though she knew no one else was home. She pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find Carl standing there, watching her with that dispassionate gaze. But the room was empty. The room smelled of dust and stale air, like it hadn't been disturbed in weeks. The desk was cluttered with papers, receipts, old bills, and letters, all piled haphazardly on top of one another. But Jessica wasn't interested in the mundane mess. Her eyes were searching for anything that might explain what Carl had been doing. As she rifled through the papers, she found notebooks, dozens of them, all filled with small, meticulous handwriting. Each page was a log, a record of Jessica's life. The dates were listed next to detailed notes on her activities. Picked up Jessica from school at 3:30 p.m., noticed she was upset about something. Refused to talk about it. Jessica stayed in her room all afternoon. Went to bed early. Jessica was on the phone with the boy. She seemed happy. The entries were chilling, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. There, buried beneath the journals, was a small folder filled with photographs. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she flipped through them. They were pictures of her, taken from the outside of her window, from a distance, and some even closer, capturing moments she didn't remember. There were shots of her sitting at her desk, laughing with friends, walking to her car, but there were others, too. More intimate photos. Photos of her changing clothes, photos of her in the bathroom, her back turned to the camera. Jessica recoiled, dropping the photographs as if they had burned her. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts racing faster than she could process them. How had he gotten these? She couldn't understand it. How long had this been going on? Her body felt numb, like she was no longer in control of her own reactions. All she could do was stare at the photographs in front of her, each one more devastating than the last. Her fingers hovered over the images, a sickening sense of violation washing over her. These weren't just candid shots from a distance, they were carefully planned, executed. Carl had been taking these pictures for months, maybe even years. The depth of his obsession was incomprehensible. Jessica felt a shudder of disgust pass through her as she pieced together the web of lies and secrecy that Carl had woven around her life. He wasn't just a cold stepfather. He was a predator, and she had been his unwitting target. But it wasn't just the photographs that terrified Jessica. It was the feeling that she had never truly been safe. Carl had been following her movements, tracking her every step, watching her every action with an unnerving level of attention. His ability to remain so unseen, to maintain such control over the situation, was terrifying. The idea that this had been happening in her own home, under the same roof as her mother, made Jessica's blood run cold. It felt like she had been living in a nightmare, but one that was too real to wake up from. The longer she stood in Carl's study, the more the weight of what she had uncovered pressed down on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable. Her own home, the place where she should have felt safe, was no longer her sanctuary. It had become a prison, a stage for Carl's sickening obsession. And the worst part was that she had never even realized it until now. She had been living in a lie, blind to the truth of her own life. With her hands shaking, Jessica backed away from the desk, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. What should I do? The question echoed in her head, but she had no answers. The discovery was too much for her to process all at once. She needed time. She needed clarity. But one thing was clear. She could no longer stay silent. She had to tell someone. But who? Her mother wouldn't believe her. Not without proof. And Carl had always been so careful, so calculating. He had never made a mistake, never left anything for Jessica to find. But now, she had the truth. Now, she had the evidence. She was no longer trapped in the dark. The only question left was what she was going to do with it. Would she confront Carl? Would she tell her mother? Would she go to the police? Or would she try to escape this nightmare on her own terms? As Jessica left Carl's study, her mind was reeling. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced with a burning sense of urgency. Carl had been watching her, controlling her, for years. And now it was her turn. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. After what Jessica had uncovered in Carl's study, everything in her life felt irrevocably changed. The cameras, the journals, the photographs. Each piece of evidence added another layer of horror to the growing realization that her stepfather had been systematically watching her, violating her privacy in the most intimate way. But as unsettling as the truth was, it was also empowering. For the first time in years, Jessica wasn't just a passive participant in her own life. She wasn't waiting for something to happen to her anymore. She had the power to confront it. But in that moment, the magnitude of what she had to face hit her all at once. Carl was no longer just the distant, cold stepfather. He had become something far more sinister. He was a predator, hiding in plain sight, and Jessica was the prey. There was no mistaking it now. She had seen the extent of his obsession, the way he had meticulously documented every moment of her life, every movement, every breath. The evidence was clear, undeniable. But even with all of this knowledge, Jessica knew she had no idea how to confront him. Her mind raced as she sat in her room, staring at the cameras and photographs she had gathered. She couldn't stay here, not with Carl lurking somewhere in the house, possibly already aware that she had discovered his secret. The danger was real, and it was closing in. She had to act, and she had to act fast.
But how?
The first step was obvious. She needed to tell her mother. Linda needed to know the truth. The thought seemed simple enough, but the reality of it was far more complicated. Jessica had always known that her mother was fiercely loyal to Carl. Linda had never questioned him, never suspected anything was wrong. In fact, she had always defended him, even when Jessica expressed her unease. Linda had been blind to Carl's darker side, believing the best in him, just as she had always believed in their family. How could Jessica convince her mother that the man she loved was capable of something so monstrous? How could she expect Linda to believe her? The idea of confronting her mother filled Jessica with dread. She cooed. LDN imagined the pain Linda would feel when faced with the reality of what Carl had been doing. Jessica had seen the way her mother looked at Carl, like he was her protector, the person who had saved her from years of loneliness after her previous relationships had fallen apart. Linda's idealized image of Carl would shatter the moment she saw the truth. But what other choice did Jessica have? She couldn't let this go on. She couldn't allow Carl to continue his twisted game. But before she could think any further, a voice echoed through the house, pulling her from her spiral of thoughts. It was Carl's voice, low and commanding, calling from downstairs. Jessica froze, the blood draining from her face. What was he doing home so soon? She hadn't expected him back for at least another hour. Panic surged through her body as she heard his footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She quickly shoved the cameras and photographs into her drawer, trying to act normal, though every instinct in her screamed to run, to hide. Carl's knock on her door made her heart leap into her throat. "Jessica?" His voice was sharp, questioning. "Are you in there?" There was no escaping now. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine. It was only a matter of time before he found out that she had discovered his secret. There was no point in delaying the confrontation any longer. With a shaky breath, Jessica opened the door. Carl stood there, as imposing as ever. He looked every bit the man he always had, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a calculated calmness in his demeanor. But Jessica could now see the cracks in his perfect facade. His eyes, usually cold and impassive, held something darker now. There was a flicker of uncertainty behind them, a guardedness that had never been there before. He had always been so controlled, so distant. But now, Jessica could sense a shift in him. The predator had been exposed, and he knew it. "Hey," Carl said, his voice low, almost too casual. He was trying to act as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't been caught red-handed. "What are you doing in here?" Jessica stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest.
She had to say something.
She couldn't just let him lie to her again. She wasn't going to let him play this game any longer. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know about the cameras, the journals, the photos. Everything." Carl's face remained impassive for a moment, as if he hadn't quite processed what she was saying. Then a slow, almost imperceptible smile spread across his face. It was a smile that sent chills down Jessica's spine, a smile that said he knew something she didn't, that he had all the power now. "You think you know," Carl said softly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But you don't. You don't understand, Jessica. Not yet." The calmness in his voice unnerved her. It was as though he was speaking to her like she was a child, as though he had anticipated this moment and was in full control of it. The unease she had felt for so long seemed to crystallize in that instant. Carl wasn't rattled. He wasn't afraid. He had planned for this. He had always been in control. And now, Jessica was the one who was exposed. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "I found the cameras, Carl. I found the pictures. I found everything. I know you've been spying on me. Spying on me, Carl. You've been watching me, and I want to know why." Carl didn't answer immediately. He stood there, his eyes cold, calculating. For a moment, Jessica could have sworn she saw a flicker of something else in his gaze, something like regret or maybe even a hint of fear. But it was fleeting, quickly replaced by that same calculated indifference that had always been there. "I didn't do anything wrong," Carl finally said, his tone eerily calm. "You misunderstand." Jessica's frustration flared. Misunderstand? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No, Carl. I didn't misunderstand anything. I saw the photos. I saw the notes. You've been following me, watching me, for months. Don't try to lie your way out of this." Carl's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed almost detached, like he was watching a child throw a tantrum. "Jessica, you don't know what you're talking about. These are just precautionary measures. Nothing more." His eyes darkened. "You don't understand the danger, do you? You don't understand what's out there. I'm trying to protect you." Jessica felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been prepared for a lie, for a defense, but this was something else entirely. He was trying to twist it to make it sound like he was the hero in this scenario. Protect her? From what? From life? From the world outside? Jessica couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Protect me? By spying on me? By taking pictures of me in my own room? How could you think that's okay? How could you justify that? Carl's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Jessica saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, something cold, calculating, and unyielding. He stepped closer to her, closing the distance between them. Jessica's breath hitched in her throat, and she instinctively took a step back. But Carl wasn't done. "You're being emotional," he said, his voice low and dangerous now. "You're overreacting. But you need to understand something, Jessica. You're mine. You've always been mine. You can't run away from that. You can't run from me." Jessica's heart raced as his words sank in. "You're mine." The way he said it, the possessiveness in his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't just about surveillance. This wasn't just about control. It was something darker, something far more twisted. She had always sensed that Carl saw her as something he could control, something he could dominate. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the cold, possessive tone in his voice, made it clear just how deeply ingrained this belief was in him. For a split second, Jessica felt the walls closing in on her, the room shrinking, the air growing thicker with each word. How had she gotten here? How had it all escalated so quickly? She had known Carl was cold, distant, and calculating, but this was a revelation. And in that moment, she realized something crucial. She was no longer dealing with just an uncomfortable stepfather. She was dealing with a predator who had been playing a long game. But Jessica refused to give in. She couldn't let Carl intimidate her. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. She took a deep breath and steeled herself. "You don't own me, Carl," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not yours, and I will never be yours." Carl's expression faltered, just for a moment, before he regained control. But Jessica could see the flicker of something. Fear, perhaps. Fear that his control was slipping, that she wasn't the helpless victim he thought she was. The power had shifted. And Jessica knew one thing for sure. She was done being a passive participant in her own story. It was time to take control of her life. She wasn't going to let Carl dictate the terms anymore. She wasn't going to let him win. The battle had only just begun. The confrontation with Carl had left Jessica shaken to her core, but it had also sparked something inside her, a fierce determination to reclaim control of her life. His words still echoed in her mind. "You're mine." The very thought of it made her stomach churn, but it also galvanized her. Jessica wasn't just going to stand idly by while Carl tried to manipulate her further. She couldn't afford to. The situation had escalated beyond what she had initially imagined, and now she knew she was in a race against time. As much as she hated to admit it, Jessica was terrified. Carl had always been a master of manipulation, capable of maintaining a calm, collected facade while hiding his darker tendencies behind a veneer of control. He hadn't flinched when she had confronted him. He hadn't backed down. Instead, he had tried to convince her that he was the one in the right, that everything he had done was out of concern for her, that he was simply protecting her from the dangers of the world. That was the most chilling part, his belief that he was justified in his actions, that he had the right to control her life. For a brief moment, Jessica had felt powerless, as if the walls of the house, once a safe haven, had become her prison. The truth of Carl's manipulation and control had hit her like a brick wall. He wasn't just some faceless abuser lurking in the shadows. He was her stepfather, the man who had been a fixture in her life for years, the man who had always been there, offering a sense of security, only now to reveal himself as a predator. But the sting of fear was fleeting. Jessica had a purpose now. She wasn't going to let Carl intimidate her into submission. She had already endured so much, his constant surveillance, his perverse obsession with her life, and she refused to be his victim any longer. If he was going to try to control her, she was going to fight back. The first thing Jessica did was leave the house. She had to get out of there, if only for a while. She needed space to think, to formulate a plan, to figure out how to protect herself from Carl's twisted game. She couldn't stay under the same roof as him any longer. Not when she knew the extent of his manipulation, not when she felt the weight of his presence pressing in on her every second. But Jessica also knew she couldn't just run away, even though the idea of escaping seemed so tempting. Leaving meant abandoning the only home she had ever known, abandoning her mother, and, most crucially, it would mean leaving Carl to continue his cruel, controlling behavior unchecked. She couldn't allow that. She needed to face this head-on, to expose the truth, and to take back control of her life. Running away would only make her a victim. No, she was going to fight. As she walked down the street, the cold night air bit at her skin, but the chill didn't compare to the gnawing fear that had settled in her gut. Where could she go? Who could she turn to? Her mother had already dismissed her fears, siding with Carl. What if no one believed her? What if she was alone in this? The thought was terrifying, but Jessica pushed it aside. She wasn't alone. She had proof, physical evidence that Carl had been spying on her, manipulating her every move. She couldn't let that evidence go to waste. She was going to fight. Jessica spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty. She knew she needed help, but who could she trust? Her mother was completely under Carl's spell, and she had no one else to turn to. Her friends? Jessica had been careful not to involve them in her personal life too much, never wanting to burden them with her troubles at home. They knew Carl was distant, but no one knew the truth of what was happening. She had to take matters into her own hands. After several sleepless nights, she knew what she had to do. The police. She needed to report Carl, to bring everything into the light. But even as the thought crossed her mind, her stomach twisted in dread. Would they believe her? What if Carl had already convinced the authorities that she was just a troubled teen, that she was making everything up? The fear of being dismissed was paralyzing, but the evidence was undeniable. Carl's journals, the hidden cameras, the photographs, they were tangible proof of his obsession, proof of his violation of her privacy. She couldn't allow that evidence to be ignored. She had to be brave. She had to expose Carl for who he really was. Jessica spent hours researching how to report the abuse. She needed to be strategic. Carl was dangerous, and she couldn't risk any mistakes. She wrote out a detailed report, gathering the photos, the journals, the recordings, anything that could support her case. She had to be thorough. She had to anticipate every angle, every scenario where Carl might try to turn the tables, to manipulate the situation in his favor. The day she decided to call the police, her hands were shaking. She had no idea how Carl would react when he found out, no idea how far he would go to cover his tracks. Would he retaliate? Would he escalate his control, his violence? Would he make sure she never spoke out again? The thought made her sick to her stomach, but she couldn't let fear stop her. This was bigger than her now. This was about taking back her life. The first call to the police was a blur of voices, questions, and reassurances. But what struck her the most was how quickly they seemed to take her seriously. When she explained what had happened, when she told them about the cameras and the journals, they didn't hesitate. They told her they would send someone over to the house to investigate. They believed her. For the first time since discovering Carl's betrayal, Jessica felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so impossible after all. Jessica didn't have much time before Carl came home, but she knew she had to act. She didn't want him to find the police at the house, to know that his lies were being unraveled. The police had told her they would arrive quietly, that they wouldn't give Carl any reason to suspect that anything was happening. She just had to stay calm, to make sure that nothing tipped him off. As the evening wore on, Jessica began to prepare for what was coming. She set up a hidden recorder in the living room, just in case Carl tried to confront her again. She knew that he would. He always had a way of manipulating her, of making her feel guilty, of making her doubt her own instincts. This time, though, she wasn't going to fall for it. She wasn't going to let him twist the truth. When Carl finally arrived home, his presence was almost suffocating. Jessica could feel him watching her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge her mood. He wasn't fooling her. She had seen enough of his manipulation to know when he was trying to control the situation. She stood her ground, ignoring the way her heart pounded in her chest. "You've been acting strange lately," Carl said, his voice low and casual, as if he was simply making an observation. "What's going on, Jessica?" "I know what you've been doing," Jessica said quietly, her voice steady, though her hands were still trembling. "I know about the cameras, the photos, everything." Carl's face went pale for a fraction of a second, before his usual, detached expression returned. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes scanning her face, searching for any signs of weakness. "You're overreacting," Carl finally said, his voice a little too calm. "None of that means anything. You're imagining things." Jessica didn't flinch. She had already prepared herself for this.
No, Carl.
"It's real, and I'm not letting you get away with it." For a long moment, there was silence. Carl seemed to be considering his next move. Then, just as Jessica thought he was about to speak, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Carl's face drained of color. His eyes flickered with panic for the briefest moment before his usual cool demeanor reasserted itself. He knew the game was up. The police arrived quietly, just as they had promised. Jessica led them through the house, showing them the hidden cameras, the journals, the photographs, and all the other evidence of Carl's twisted obsession. He tried to deny everything, of course, but the evidence was overwhelming. As the police took him into custody, Jessica watched him closely. His calm facade was gone now, replaced by the frantic desperation of a man who knew his world was crumbling. For the first time in years, Jessica felt free. The burden of fear, the weight of Carl's control, had been lifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was finally living. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The road ahead would be long. The trauma of what Carl had done to her would take time to heal, but Jessica knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the prey. She was the one in control now, and nothing would ever take that away from her again. The police had come. They had taken Carl into custody, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jessica could breathe. Freedom. It wasn't the kind of liberation she had once imagined, bright, exhilarating, like stepping out into the sun after years of darkness. Instead, it felt fragile, like walking on the thin crust of an ice pond, unsure if each step would hold her weight. Carl was arrested. The cameras had been found. His journals, his twisted notes, the hundreds of pages that chronicled his obsession, those were all now in the hands of the police. The evidence was undeniable. But even as the weight of the situation settled around her, Jessica could feel an unsettling sense of emptiness creeping in. Yes, she had what she wanted. The truth had come to light. Carl was behind bars, and she no longer had to live in fear of his surveillance. But it wasn't a victory she had anticipated. It didn't feel like a triumph. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something far more complex, something deeper than she could have imagined. What had she won, really? After Carl's arrest, Jessica was flooded with a mixture of emotions: relief, anger, guilt, even confusion. She had wanted this for so long. She had dreamed of the day when she could confront him, when she would no longer be a prisoner in her own home. Now that it had happened, Jessica couldn't shake the disorienting feeling that something vital was missing. She had exposed Carl for what he truly was, a manipulative predator who had violated the most fundamental trust between a father and daughter. And yet, as the police processed him, and as her mother continued to insist that everything would be okay, Jessica felt the crushing weight of an aftermath she hadn't expected. Her mother, Linda, had reacted predictably. In the hours after Carl's arrest, she was a shell of the woman Jessica had known. The person who had always defended Carl, who had trusted him with her life, was now lost in a haze of denial, anger, and confusion. Linda refused to see the man she had been married to as the monster Jessica knew him to be. Even when the police showed her the photographs and read the police report, Linda couldn't accept the truth. "This isn't him," she had said, her voice trembling as she stared at the incriminating evidence. "Carl would never do this. There's been some kind of mistake." Jessica stood there, watching her mother's desperate refusal to face the reality of their lives. Her mother still loved Carl. It was a truth Jessica couldn't escape, no matter how many times she told herself that Carl had been abusing her. There was no easy way to explain the mental and emotional toll this situation had taken on her mother, the years of gaslighting and manipulation that Carl had used to keep Linda in the dark. Her mother had been his accomplice, not intentionally, but through the sheer power of his charm and influence. It was a painful reality to confront, but it was the truth. Still, even though Jessica couldn't expect her mother to understand or accept the situation right away, it didn't stop the growing ache in her chest. This wasn't how she had envisioned this day. She had imagined a reunion, a moment of understanding, of relief, of her mother finally seeing her for who she was. She had thought that once Carl was gone, they could start anew, that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. But now, standing in the middle of their home, Jessica realized how deeply fractured her world had become. She couldn't go back to the way things had been. Carl's arrest, his confession, everything they had uncovered, it had shattered everything she had known, and it left her standing in the ruins, unsure of what to do next. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, media coverage, and a general sense of chaos. Jessica had never expected the fallout from Carl's arrest to be so overwhelming. She was bombarded with questions from reporters, from neighbors, from well-meaning friends who had heard about the arrest. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, wanted to understand how it all went down. The scrutiny was suffocating. But what no one seemed to understand, not even her mother, was that the truth of it all wasn't just about Carl's actions. It was about the damage that had been done to her, Jessica, throughout all of it. She had spent years living under the suffocating weight of Carl's surveillance, his control. For so long, she had been convinced that she was being paranoid, that she was overreacting, that the strange feelings of discomfort she had whenever Carl watched her or touched her were just her imagination. But now, with the evidence in hand, Jessica understood how deeply Carl had scarred her. He hadn't just violated her privacy. He had manipulated her mind, played with her emotions, twisted her perception of reality to the point where she was questioning her own instincts. And even though he was gone now, the psychological toll it had taken on her wasn't something that could be erased overnight. The legal process moved forward swiftly. Carl was charged with multiple counts of surveillance and stalking, and as the investigation deepened, other disturbing details about his past began to emerge. There were other women, other victims that Carl had manipulated and hurt, though none had ever come forward. But with the media attention surrounding Jessica's case, those other women found the courage to speak out, too. The case began to unravel in ways Jessica hadn't anticipated, and each revelation brought more turmoil. It felt like the walls of her world were crumbling down around her, each new discovery shaking her foundation even more. It wasn't just the legal proceedings that took a toll on her. It was the way everything had changed. Her relationship with her mother was never going to be the same. Linda may have been blinded by love, but Jessica couldn't pretend anymore. The love her mother had for Carl was a betrayal in itself, a betrayal that would never fully heal, not in Jessica's eyes. They could never go back to being the family they once were. Carl had cast a shadow over everything, and that shadow would linger for a long time. As the months passed, Jessica tried to rebuild her life. She went to therapy, trying to untangle the mess that Carl had made of her thoughts and emotions. It was hard, harder than anything she'd ever done. Some days, the pain seemed unbearable, like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Other days, it felt like the truth was more real than ever. She was finally free of Carl's hold, but in many ways, she was still trapped by the aftermath of his actions. The constant fear, the constant wondering whether anyone would ever understand, whether she would ever be whole again. It was something that no one could truly comprehend unless they had been through it themselves. One thing became painfully clear to Jessica. There was no true victory here. Exposing Carl for what he was, for what he had done, sure, it had brought some measure of justice, some sense of relief. But in the end, she didn't just need Carl to be punished. She needed her life back. She needed the years that Carl had stolen from her. She needed to heal. And that was something no arrest, no legal action could give her. The trial came next. It was a public spectacle, with the media all but camped outside the courthouse. Carl's defense team did their best to discredit Jessica, to paint her as a troubled teenager looking for attention. But Jessica stood firm. The evidence was clear, and despite the attempts to manipulate the story, the truth won out. Carl was convicted on all charges, sentenced to a long prison term. But even as the verdict was read, Jessica felt no elation.
It was over, yes.
Carl was behind bars, and that was one victory in itself. But in many ways, it felt like a hollow one. The scars, the trauma, the years of control, those things couldn't be erased by a courtroom victory. She would have to carry them with her for the rest of her life. In the months following the trial, Jessica found herself at a crossroads. She had what she had wanted. The truth had been exposed. Carl had been punished. But it was clear that the battle wasn't over. Now came the hardest part: healing. Learning to live with herself, to reclaim the pieces of her life that had been stolen by fear and manipulation. She began to rebuild bit by bit. She reconnected with old friends who had been kept at arm's length for so long, finding solace in their support. She pursued her education more seriously, determined to prove to herself that she was more than Carl had ever allowed her to believe. And slowly, with time, she started to feel something like peace. Not joy, not happiness, not yet, but peace. She was free, but that freedom didn't come without a price. Carl had taken so much from her, and while she had achieved what she set out to do, exposing the truth, it wasn't the clean, satisfying victory she had imagined. She had won, yes, but in the process, she had lost so much more. And now, the real work of healing, of rebuilding, was just beginning. In the end, Jessica learned something fundamental. True freedom isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about living with it, confronting the damage it causes, and finding a way to move forward. It was going to take time, but she was determined. She wasn't Carl's victim anymore. She was her own person now. And that, at least, was a victory worth holding on to. The day Carl was sentenced felt anticlimactic, as if the very air in the courtroom had been sucked out, leaving everyone in a hollow state of disbelief. Jessica sat there, staring at Carl, who had a strange, almost smug look on his face. Despite the conviction, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Carl seemed unshaken. If anything, he looked like a man who had been caught in a trap he had no idea how to escape, but in his eyes, there was still that cold, calculating glimmer. Jessica felt a shudder run through her, but she didn't let it show. It was over. Or was it? Her breath caught in her throat as the gavel fell.
Guilty.
Carl was sentenced to 25 years, his future locked behind bars. And yet, even as the verdict was announced, Jessica felt a deep, almost unnameable sense of loss. She had won. But what was the price? The damage Carl had inflicted on her life, her mind, her sense of self, was not something that could be undone by a courtroom victory. No amount of legal justice could replace the years she had lost, the parts of herself that Carl had stolen. The months following Carl's conviction were a blur of mundane routines and soul-crushing realizations. Jessica was free, or at least she thought she was. But being free from Carl's immediate presence didn't feel like the release she had imagined. It wasn't the instant relief she had envisioned, as if the moment Carl was removed from her life, everything would go back to normal. But normal was gone. The Jessica who had lived in constant fear for so long, always watching over her shoulder, always second-guessing herself, was gone. And in her place stood someone unsure of who she even was, of how to live without the weight of Carl's control in her life. What no one understood, what no one could understand, was that the victory wasn't the arrest, the conviction, or even the months of court battles that had finally put Carl away. The true battle was what came after. When the cameras had stopped flashing, when the media had moved on, and when the court cases became a distant memory. That was when the true cost of her freedom hit her, and it wasn't something she had been prepared for. In the quiet of her room late at night, Jessica would find herself staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spiraling.
Who am I now?
The question gnawed at her. Carl had been her shadow for so long. Even when he wasn't physically present, his influence had permeated every corner of her life. Every action, every word she spoke, had been shaped by his control. He had conditioned her, manipulated her, twisted her into someone she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. And now that he was gone, now that the external threat had been removed, she was left to pick up the pieces of herself. But she didn't know where to start. It wasn't just the trauma of being under constant surveillance, of having her every move scrutinized. It was the psychological damage, the subtle, insidious way Carl had made her doubt her own instincts, her own worth. For years, she had believed she was crazy, paranoid, selfish, that everything she felt was an exaggeration. He had made her feel as if she had no right to her own privacy, no right to her own body, no right to her own emotions. Carl had spent years warping her sense of reality, and even though he was locked away, the ghost of his manipulation lingered like an invisible fog around her. Every time Jessica walked into a room, she wondered if Carl's influence would still hang in the air. She began to notice the small ways in which his presence lingered in her daily life. The ways she second-guessed herself in situations where she used to feel confident. The ways she couldn't sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. The ways she flinched when someone got too close, when someone raised their voice, when someone simply looked at her the wrong way. Every little thing seemed to send a ripple of fear through her, and she hated it. She didn't want to be afraid anymore. She didn't want to feel like a shell of a person, walking through life on autopilot, stuck in a state of heightened vigilance. Therapy helped, or at least it helped in the way that it could. She spoke to the counselor about the things she had never dared to say aloud. She spoke of the abuse, of the fear, of the loneliness. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand the depth of what Carl had done to her. But understanding didn't make it better. It didn't make the anger go away. It didn't undo the damage. And that was the hardest part. She had spent so long fighting against Carl's control that she hadn't stopped to think about what it would be like to simply exist outside of it. Now that she was free, now that she had the chance to heal, she realized that the pain she felt wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, about everything she had lost in the years of abuse. Her relationship with her mother was strained, to say the least. Linda had believed Carl's lies for so long, had been so deeply entrenched in his manipulation, that she couldn't see the truth. She refused to see Jessica's suffering for what it was, and that rejection felt like another betrayal. How could her mother not see what Carl had done? How could she not see the scars that ran deeper than anything visible? Linda's refusal to acknowledge the reality of the situation made Jessica feel more isolated. It was as if her mother had drawn a line in the sand, a line that Jessica could not cross, no matter how hard she tried. Linda wanted to protect the image of the man she had loved for so long, and in doing so, she shut Jessica out. No matter how much Jessica explained, no matter how much she tried to make Linda see the truth, her mother simply refused to acknowledge the damage that had been done. This added another layer of grief to an already overwhelming situation. It wasn't just Carl who had caused her pain, it was her mother's refusal to accept the truth, to face the horror of what had been done to her daughter. Jessica's relationships with friends were equally complicated. Her closest friends had been supportive, but they didn't fully understand the depths of her trauma. They had never lived under the shadow of someone like Carl, someone who could twist the truth, who could make her doubt herself at every turn. And though they wanted to help, Jessica knew they couldn't. No one could truly understand what it felt like to be under constant surveillance, to live in a world where everything about you was scrutinized, where your every move was watched, analyzed, and manipulated. No one could understand the fear that came with the constant knowledge that someone was out there controlling your life, controlling your thoughts, and controlling your body. As time passed, Jessica found herself retreating more and more into herself. The friendships that had once been her refuge now seemed shallow and distant. She couldn't shake the feeling that no one could ever truly understand her. The guilt of surviving, the guilt of speaking out when others had not, gnawed at her. She was the one who had survived, who had fought back. But in many ways, the fight wasn't over. It wasn't over when Carl was arrested, when Carl was convicted. The fight, as it turned out, was internal. It was the fight to reclaim herself. There were moments, brief flashes of clarity, when Jessica could almost feel like herself again. On rare occasions, when she found herself laughing with an old friend, or when she achieved something, anything, that made her feel like she was in control of her life again, there was a moment of peace. But those moments always felt fleeting. The price of freedom, it seemed, was this constant battle against the parts of herself that had been warped by Carl. And then there were the nights, the long, quiet nights when she was alone with her thoughts, and the old fears would creep back in. The memories of Carl's cold gaze, the endless watching, the feeling of being trapped. It wasn't just the physical abuse. It was the mental manipulation. Carl had made Jessica question everything, her worth, her reality, her ability to trust her own instincts. And even now, with Carl behind bars, the echoes of that manipulation lingered. Despite all of this, despite the toll it took on her, Jessica knew something deep down. She had paid a heavy price, but she had paid it willingly. The truth had been more painful than she ever could have imagined. The cost of exposing Carl, of standing up for herself, had taken more from her than she had expected. But she had done it anyway. She had found the strength to speak out, to confront the truth, and to fight for her freedom. And in doing so, she had proven something to herself that no one else could take away. She was stronger than Carl had ever known. Stronger than she had ever known. It was a slow process, healing, rebuilding, learning to trust again. But it was her journey now. No one could take that away from her. And despite the price she had paid, Jessica was beginning to understand that the freedom she had fought for was hers. No one, not even Carl, could control her anymore. She was her own person, and that, in the end, was worth every cost. The months following Carl's conviction marked a period of slow, often painful transformation for Jessica. It wasn't just about the day-to-day existence, the normal rhythms of life that she had been trying to re-establish. It was deeper than that. It was the gradual emergence of someone new, someone who was learning to live without the shadow of Carl looming over her. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, Jessica would often find herself thinking about the kind of person she was becoming and whether it was even possible to return to a version of herself before Carl's abuse. She had been so completely shaped by that experience, so completely bound to the fear and manipulation that defined her reality, that the very idea of returning to normal felt almost like a fantasy. Normal was a foreign concept now. In a way, she had to return to a familiar situation, but the familiar situation was no longer one she recognized. Her home, once a place of terror, was now empty, save for her mother, who had never fully reconciled with the reality of Jessica's accusations. The house, the rooms that had once echoed with Carl's presence, now seemed to hold a different kind of silence, a more oppressive silence that reminded Jessica of everything that had happened within those walls. She was no longer the girl who had been a prisoner in her own home. She was free. But with that freedom came a terrifying sense of unfamiliarity. Jessica still lived in the same house with her mother, but it was no longer the place where she had once felt safe. The world she had once known had irrevocably changed. The kitchen, Once the scene of casual family meals now felt cold, every corner a reminder of the years of fear she had lived with. The walls of her childhood home seemed to whisper with echoes of her past, of Carl's manipulations, of her mother's unshakable loyalty to a man who had stolen her peace. But no matter how hard Jessica tried, no matter how much she wished to move forward, the memories kept creeping back. They were like ghosts, hanging around the edges of her thoughts, waiting for the smallest trigger to bring them back to life. Her relationship with Linda, her mother, was the most challenging part of this new reality. Linda had never truly believed Jessica's allegations. She had brushed them aside, perhaps out of love, or perhaps out of her own denial. For years, she had ignored the signs, convinced that Jessica was simply going through a phase, or that Jessica's paranoia was an overreaction to normal father-daughter friction. When Carl's crimes came to light, Linda's world collapsed. The woman who had once trusted Carl with her entire life was now faced with a truth that shattered everything she had believed in. But even now, after everything, Linda refused to acknowledge the depth of her complicity. It was as if she had to protect the image of the man she had loved for so many years, even if that meant rejecting the very daughter who had fought to reveal his true nature. The tension between Jessica and her mother hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Linda's inability to confront the reality of Carl's actions left Jessica feeling more isolated than ever. Every conversation felt like an attempt to reach out, only to be met with a brick wall of denial. Jessica had tried, more than once, to explain her pain, to show her mother the depth of what Carl had done to her, both physically and psychologically. But Linda's defenses remained high. She couldn't bring herself to look at her daughter with the eyes of a survivor. She saw Jessica as a victim, but not as a warrior. She saw Jessica as fragile, as broken, not as the resilient young woman who had fought for her own life. Linda continued to carry on with her life, trying to move forward, trying to act as if everything was normal. But Jessica could no longer pretend. She was no longer the same person who had blindly loved Carl and accepted the world as it was. Jessica had seen the truth for what it was. She had been forced to confront the deepest, darkest corners of her life, and it had changed her. She couldn't simply go back to pretending that everything was okay. That was the hardest part, to see her mother still chained to the illusions that Carl had spun, while Jessica was left to face the aftermath of their shattered world. It was in this emotional distance, this chasm that had formed between them, that Jessica began to realize the depth of her own transformation. She had survived Carl's abuse, not just physically, but mentally. She had faced her fears and fought for her life, and in doing so, she had unearthed an inner strength she hadn't known existed. But surviving was only part of the equation. Learning to live again, to reclaim her life, to find new meaning in a world that had once been tainted by Carl's presence, this was where the real challenge lay. It was one thing to survive.
It was another to thrive.
Jessica started to spend more time on her own, finding solace in solitary activities. Reading had always been a way to escape, a way to transport herself into different worlds where she could forget about her own. Books became her refuge. She also found herself spending more time drawing and writing, documenting her thoughts, her fears, and her triumphs. Art became a kind of therapy, a way to process the emotions that she hadn't yet fully understood. Her drawings were raw, unfiltered, capturing the chaos of her emotions in a way that words never could. Each sketch, each word on paper, felt like a small step toward reclaiming herself. In some ways, she felt like a different person than she had been before the trial. Her confidence was shaken, but there was something more profound in her now, an inner clarity. Carl's actions had taught her the value of boundaries, of self-worth, of standing up for herself in the face of overwhelming odds. The trauma hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But she had learned to live with it. She had learned to control it, to give herself permission to feel the pain without letting it define her. One of the hardest aspects of this new reality was coming to terms with the loss of innocence, the innocence that had once allowed her to trust without question. She had learned to trust herself again, but trust in others in relationships, this was where she faltered. It was one thing to trust in your own strength, in your own ability to survive. It was another thing entirely to believe that others, especially those closest to you, would protect you in the same way. Her mother's refusal to accept the truth of what Carl had done to her left Jessica questioning not only Linda's role in her life, but her own ability to trust others. She had fought so hard to break free of Carl's hold, and now she had to fight to reclaim her relationships, to rebuild the connections that had been tainted by years of manipulation and lies. Slowly, Jessica began to rebuild her sense of identity, piece by piece. She made new friends, people who saw her not as a victim but as someone with agency, someone who could contribute to the world in a meaningful way. She started volunteering at a local shelter for young women who had experienced abuse, finding a sense of purpose in helping others who had faced similar struggles. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She had been given a second chance, and now, for the first time, she felt ready to use it, not just for herself, but for others. One afternoon, while sitting in the park, watching the sunset, Jessica realized something profound. She had returned to a familiar situation, the same place she had always known, the same home, the same environment. But this time it was different. She had returned, but she was no longer the person who had once been trapped in that home. She had transformed. She looked around and realized that her entire perception of the world had shifted. The world was no longer a place of fear, but one of possibility. Carl's shadow no longer haunted her steps. She had taken back her power. It wasn't an easy journey, and it wasn't a perfect one. There would be days of doubt, days of pain, and days when the memories of the past would resurface. But for the first time in years, Jessica felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. Jessica had returned to a familiar situation, yes, but she had come back armed with a new truth, that she was stronger than she had ever known, that she was capable of healing, and that she deserved to live a life free from fear and manipulation. The journey was far from over. There would be more battles to face, more pain to endure, and more moments of doubt. But now, she knew who she was. She knew what she was capable of, and that made all the difference. As she sat in the park, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the horizon, Jessica smiled softly to herself. She had returned, but this time, she was whole.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.